Hello, my name is Erwin Ironstone, and I'm here to talk today about what's happening in generic drug prescriptions. It's based on a story in the New York Times, and I'll go into that in a little bit. There's a war that's going on between generic and brand name drugs. One of the reasons for this type of action, or wars between the two, is money. The root of all evil, of course. Usually what happens is when you get drugs, they don't come directly to the pharmacy. They come through a benefits manager who interfaces with the pharmacy. And many people get their prescriptions filled through a third party that pharmacies recognize. And again, that's called pharmacy benefits managers. An article in the New York Times published on August 6, 2017 talks about this issue. Talks about pharmacies and how much they charge and pharmacy benefit managers. Since many individuals are on some type of government reimbursement, most likely the government is overpaying for drugs. And we'll go into that in a little bit also. Some branches of the government can negotiate directly. Evidently, Medicare cannot. Type of price fixing by drug manufacturers, either when there are generic or when the brand name is the sole source, is a monopoly. And there's lots of overcharging that goes on. Both political parties at one time or another during the election seasons said we have to do something about this because, you know, it's hurting the economy and it's hurting the average American who can't pay outrageous fees for pharmaceuticals. In any case, one thing that should happen is that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, or possibly the Justice Department should look into the issues related to overcharging for drugs. Frequently, drugs in other countries are much less expensive than they are in this country. And we'll go into that topic in another show. In the past, and again, the article talks about take the generic patients are told until they're not. And it's by Charles Orenstein and Katie Thomas. And it talks about this issue. In any case, what's happening is in the past, people were told to ask for the generic because they'll get a discount. And, you know, the discount can be very, very significant. Okay. The article itself was written through a collaboration between reporters from the New York Times and ProPublica, which is an independent nonprofit organization. It's standard procedures for people who get drugs to ask for a generic because a generic is usually significantly less expensive than the brand name drug. The article gives a few examples where consumers, rather than get the generic, were forced to get the brand name, and the prescription bills, obviously for the individual, went up significantly. And the figure was $90 a month for the brand name version compared to $10 as a co-payment when you get the generic. The insurance company involved in this particular case was Humana, who is one of those pharmacy benefit managers. And although they were called multiple times, they didn't respond or make any comments related to this. In any case, with each visit to the pharmacy, Mr. X, I'll call him that, enters the upside-down world of prescription drugs, where conventional wisdom about how to lower drug costs is often wrong. Consumers have grown accustomed to being told by insurers and middlemen known as pharmacy benefit managers that they must give up their branded drugs because they're much more expensive than the generic drugs. The way things are going, sometimes the brand name drugs are actually less expensive for the companies that act as intermediaries because there's some type of deal made by the brand name drug. And they give one example of this where they showed just what's happening, and there are certain benefits and rewards for pharmacy benefit managers that makes it easier and more profitable for them to get the branded name rather than the generic. And it's very hard to track these things down, but it's happening for years, and no one appears to be interested in looking into it or doing anything about it, although both political parties put that as one of the high item lists things that they want to do. Many consumers are basically making comments on social media because the practice of having to buy a brand name drug is outrageous. They gave an example of a brand name drug, which is Adderall XR, which is an extended release. Adderall is for attention deficit disorder, and what the company who makes Adderall has done is made some deals with benefit managers, and because of that they've been able to retain a larger portion of the market even though there are generic drugs. Some of the ways that companies retain a larger share of the market is by making deals with the companies who sell generic. And usually there have been problems with that, although companies have come to agreements because they all make out better and the consumer and the American public do not. One of the points in the article talks about a doctor who actually got a call from a pharmacist saying, "Can you please fill out your prescription forms with the brand name or give a justification because the insurer would not pay for the generic when they're getting sweet deals with the branded name pills." There are all types of gimmicks and payoffs where the branded companies are reducing their price, but not to the consumer, but to the middlemen and to the pharmacists. And they do that by giving them a larger share and holding a small share, but getting a larger volume, because most drugs, after a couple of years, when there's a generic, lose significant market share. I think one of the research firms said they go down to about 6% of the prescriptions filled. One of the benefit managers, and this is United Healthcare, said the insurers does at times prefer brand name drugs. By providing access to these drugs at a lower cost, we're able to improve affordability for our customers and members, he said in an email. But what he doesn't say is there's an under the table, or not so under the table, payoff by the brand name manufacturer that reduces the cost of the brand name drugs to the insurer, but not necessarily to the consumer. Another issue is sometimes the insurance or benefit managers are not required to pick up part of the cost until the consumer reaches a minimum amount that they've paid for drugs, and only at that point, does it pay for drugs for the consumer. So that's another factor that comes in that favors brand names, because they're more expensive, and that may be beneficial not to the consumer but to the pharmacist and also to the benefits manager. At one point it talks about Shire, the company who makes Adderall, made a deal with some generic companies to sell their Adderall RX, but what happened was the companies were not given enough pills, so they sued the Shire company, and the groups got together and basically agreed to push or to sell the Adderall XR, but there were additional amounts of money that transferred hands, and Shire makes out because the volume that they sell remains higher than it would against generics, and therefore they get more money, which is the name of the game. Today, about 90% of all drugs are generic, and the other 10% are the branded names. And I'm not sure why, but that's basically what's been happening in the country. The article also talks about after about 2 years, the average amount of sales of a branded drug comes to about 6% of the total once generics have been introduced. In the article itself, it gives costs of the generic and the amounts that go to the benefit manager and or the pharmacists. And what I thought was interesting here was that the group who made the branded pill were willing to accept a significantly lower price. What I found interesting is that once there was in fact a generic, the companies who made the branded drug were willing to accept a smaller percentage of the price of the drug than they would have been otherwise. It was interesting because, again, we're talking about Shire and the spokeswoman there who said while Shire did not make decisions about how much patients paid in out-of-pocket costs, Shire is helping to deliver cost savings to the system and greater patient access to an important medicine. And the answer is yes, because they're making deals and it's still costing the consumer much more than it would have otherwise. One of the changes in the way pills have been allocated is that those who make the branded pills are trying in any way they can to retain market share. I think Pfizer at one point had made an agreement to supply pills to a generic manufacturer if they would hold off producing the generics for a certain period of time. And this happens, I guess, as a common approach in the drug markets. One of the interesting things that comes up, I'm not sure where I have it, but evidently it takes, once a company makes a drug, they retain the right to make, basically to sell the drug for 20 years. But one of the problems is that before they can sell it, they have to have testing of the drugs. And testing can sometimes take 8 years or more. So effectively they only have 12 years where they're a monopoly on a particular drug. And during that time, they've been known to raise the price and either have the benefit managers or the consumers pay a significantly higher price. Another interesting factor is many of our drugs are made in Canada, in China, and in India. And one of the things I didn't realize is that usually the Food and Drug Administration has agreements with each of the countries where drugs are manufactured to have on-site inspectors. So the drugs that you can get from Canada or from India or from China, for that matter, all have inspectors, U.S. inspectors, on site to ensure that the drugs are made in the proper percentages and duplicate the contents of drugs that are in fact made in the United States. I believe someplace in here in the law, 40% of all drugs are allowed to be imported, and 80% of the chemicals in the drugs can be imported, and in that way the final product is made in the United States, but 80% of that composition is based on chemicals and compounds that were made in foreign countries. So made in America doesn't necessarily indicate how much of a particular drug is made in America based on chemicals that are imported from other countries. As I said before, one of the problems is that Medicare can't negotiate with drug manufacturers directly. And if there are bonuses, Medicare gets a percentage, but most likely their percentage does not offset what the American medical system, Medicare, would pay if they were allowed to negotiate prices directly with some of the manufacturers. One of the, quote, things that happens is benefit managers or drug plans don't usually tell the patient that they can have the doctor write down or generic, if available, on the prescription. And unless the doctor gets word, then they don't put down or generic equivalent, which means the consumer pays for the entire price of the non-generic, but the branded pill. The consumer pays for the entire price of the branded pill and doesn't pay the price of the generic. Another interesting factor, as far as I can see, is even when pills are made overseas, it doesn't mean that there's a reduced cost. And even after pills or medications become generic, they still are significantly higher than they are in other countries. And Americans can pay sometimes double what drugs cost in other countries. In fact, one of the articles I read gave an example where a pill for hepatitis C costs about $1,000 in this country, while if you wanted to get the same pill in India, it's $4. And there's talk in Congress about allowing Americans to buy some of their drugs overseas. This may not even require a law. It may require just an executive order that allows people to get drugs overseas. But I'm sure that since pharmaceuticals have large budgets to influence Congress, very few congressmen would vote to have the generics available from overseas distributors. And what's interesting here is the pharmaceuticals question whether in fact the drugs meet the United States standards, but they have them basically manufactured overseas under the same stringent standards that we have in this country. There was one pharmacist who was asked about what was happening in his pharmacies, where the drugs are in fact higher priced, especially the branded, and his response was, there's only one reason why we're requiring you to use a more expensive product. He said, because someone down the road, somebody is earning more money, and that's either the insurance companies or pharmaceutical benefit managers or the pharmacists, but it certainly isn't being distributed to the consumers. I guess that's the end of this. But again, how can we change this? Right now it takes a very long time for drugs to be actually used because you have to test them. And testing can take 7 or 8 years, and frequently the testing isn't done in this country, in the United States. Because testing in the United States is so expensive, companies would rather introduce new drugs or new mechanical devices overseas and do the testing in an overseas environment where the cost is significantly lower. What's also interesting is when that's done, they FDA, Food and Drug Administration, would accept the results of many of those overseas tests and would then approve the drugs without having to do the testing in this country. I think that when drug companies gouge the public because they can, because it's a monopoly, someone should look into it, whether it's the Justice Department or the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, because we as Americans pay the highest price for drugs in the world. Some countries pay significantly less, and some pay probably a third or 20% of what we pay in this country. There are several solutions. One is to speed up the testing process. Another solution is, as new technologies are developed, the testing of drugs can be made much more quickly and also more inexpensively than they are now. Third way to get things into the system might be for the government to give incentives to competing drugs, so that if the drugs are in fact produced and are equivalent or close, they can then be introduced at a discount rather than what the original maker had to do, and that would reduce the costs also. Again, it might mean playing with a patent system, might mean getting both parties to agree. I mean, the drug companies now, I think the article gave a 20-year estimate and said drug companies were hiring lobbyists, and it was about $15 million a year for the last 20 years. So it's a huge amount of money that's being spent by the pharmaceutical companies. And perhaps we should limit that, and we should also ask our representatives why and how they voted for specific bills. I don't doubt that some of the bills are drafted by drug manufacturers rather than congressmen, and they're accepted. I think we have the best government that money can buy, and it's time to change that. Thank you for listening, and I hope to have another video available talking about the differences in costs associated with getting drugs in the United States versus overseas. Thank you again. This is Justice in America.